Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for choosing this very important session, and you're clearly the most intellectually gifted of all the people here. So thank you for that. I just want to introduce our speakers. I will attempt to keep us to time, even though I've failed at the first hurdle and we're kicking off 3 minutes late. Today's session, we're focusing on families, communities and vulnerable populations. My name's Karen Price. I'm the Deputy CEO of ACON. ACON's New South Wales leading and Australia's largest organisation that focuses on HIV care and support and LGBTI health. It's my great pleasure to introduce a colleague, a board member and generally smart and amazing person, Dr. Julie Mooney-Somers. She's going to talk to us about alcohol, tobacco and illicit drug use among lesbian, bisexual and queer women in Sydney. Insights from the SWASH periodic survey. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Karen. So I'd like to start by paying my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the custodians of the land where I live and work and where SWASH has lived for 23 years, and the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land in which we share knowledge today. I also want to acknowledge the many people who've had a part in developing and sustaining SWASH over the last 23 years. And I will name check in particular Juliet Richters and Garrett Prestige, who were made it happen, and the many people over the years at ACON. I'm delighted that Karen is here to chair this session, so I can do a particular nod to Karen for your support. I was honoured to take custody, and it does feel like I only have custody of SWASH about 10 years ago. So it existed before me and it will exist beyond me, I'm sure. Finally, a shout out to my partner in crime, Rachel Deacon. Rachel is the stats brain, the connection to frontline AOD services. She works at the Langton Centre and has worked just as many weekend hours as I have to keep SWASH going. So what I wanted to use this platform today, and I want you to know I'm really clearly thinking about it as I have a platform that I want to use, is to tell you a little bit about SWASH, which is an incredible example of a community-university partnership that's been running for a very long time. I want to share some critical indicator data on AOD, and depending on how my timing goes, on mental health. And I want to show you some of the important work that this has allowed to happen. And I'm also going to leave you with a challenge to think about in your own work. But let's start back at the beginning. So in the early 90s, there was some concern wrapped up in panic, hysteria, and some pretty horrendous stigmatization around the possibility that the HIV epidemic was going to move from the homosexual to the general population through female partners of bisexually active men. There's some pretty awful newspaper reports around the time using very stigmatizing language, and some of that was based on a project that happened called the Women Partners of Bisexual Men Phone Project, which was a partnership between what was then National Centre on HIV Social Research when they were at Macquarie. There's a lot of history here, people. The National Centre on HIV Epidemiology Clinical Research, what was then the AIDS Council of New South Wales, and the Western Sydney Area Health Service. And so there was a really interesting partnership of people who did this phone project that demonstrated that there were things to be concerned about. In 1995, the SMASH survey happened, which was the Sydney Men and Sexual Health survey, which is now, of course, GCPS, Gay Community Periodic Survey. And in 96, the first SWASH survey happened, which was this Sydney Women's Sexual Health Survey, specifically for women who were in contact with gay and lesbian communities in Sydney. It was a collaboration between the Gay and Lesbian Injecting Drug Use Project at ACON, the Women Partners of Gay and Bisexual Men Project at Western Sydney Area Health, and researchers then at UNSW. It was a 2-page survey. It happened primarily at Fair Day and some events around the Mardi Gras season, and 585 women completed it. To people's surprise, most of the women who completed it were lesbians. And so it's interesting to see what then happened was that the survey shifted slightly in its orientation, more specifically to see itself as a survey that was around lesbian and bisexual women's health. And you can kind of track that, actually. I've been reading some of the early annual reports from ACON that kind of shows some of that change happening over time. So SWASH has run every 2 years since that, making it unquestionably the longest running periodic survey of lesbian, bisexual, queer men's health in the world. In the same kind of way, events and venues during the Mardi Gras season, it's still a 2-page paper survey. I'm happy to argue with anybody afterwards about why that's a better idea than online. We use peer recruiters, and I've put some photographs up here of recruitment happening at different venues over the last couple of years, and I want you to notice the almost entire absence of the University of Sydney logo from anything. So the university doesn't have much of visibility in terms of data collection, and peer recruiters are all trained by ACON, they're all recruited by ACON. And so I think it's really important that SWASH has always been seen as a community-owned project. So in 2018, we had just over 1,200 people completed the survey. Paper survey, again, peer recruiters at 20 venues and events, which was a pretty massive undertaking. We also ran an online survey in the month after Mardi Gras. So SWASH is now about much more than sexual health, which is where it started. This is a list of some of the topics that we covered in 2018. Most of the questions don't change from iteration to iteration, so there's a little bit, we kind of bring in one-off questions in some years about particular things that ACON is interested in or concerned about. And I think it's a really nice demonstration of the way that the survey is very live and dynamic and responsive to the kinds of issues that might be coming up in the community, which ACON understands and knows about. But one of the things I really wanted to emphasize here is it's a 2-page survey. So what we're really talking about here is critical indicators. So we don't and we can't provide sophisticated statistical analysis of drivers and predictors and all of that kind of thing. And that's because we've really got top-level information about particular health issues that we think are critical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of those critical health indicators. But before I do that, one of the most common questions I get asked about SWASH is whether it's representative or not. So let me tell you a bit about the sample. The median age is nearly always 32, 33, 34. There's been not much change. Highly educated, and again, there's been no change around that level of education. And I think it's worth saying that most of the research I've been involved with around LGBT health finds that actually levels of education are higher among LGBT than the general population. Majority full-time employed, dependent kids, not bad diversity in terms of ethnicity. We don't ask great questions around that. Increasingly better Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander participation, so that's about twice the rate that you'd find in the general population. Lesbian, bisexual, queer women and non-binary people never lived in gay Sydney. It's 3% now. I think it was about 5 or 7% when they first ran the survey, although we still call it Gay Sydney. So we're talking here about Darlinghurst, Kings Cross, Potts Point kind of area. And indeed, they're not really in the eastern suburbs either. So we're talking really about a population that's concentrated in the city, inner west area, and in the western suburbs and Blue Mountains. So that's where most of the people who respond to our survey come from. So let me address this question about representativeness. In some ways, the response to that is representative of what? And I think it's really important to think about what it is that people are asking me about when they ask this, which is what they want to know, is this representative of all lesbian, bisexual and queer women in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia? I have no idea. We don't know about lesbian, bisexual and queer women in the population because the census doesn't ask sexuality and gender indicator questions, as anyone who's been paying attention to the news this week will know. So we actually don't really know what the characteristics of LBQ women in the population are. So my answer to this question is now, I think it's very representative of LBQ women who are engaged with community in Sydney. We've been asking these similar questions to similar people in similar ways at the same time of year for 23 years, 24 years next year when we do it again. I'm pretty confident that what we're capturing is what's happening around people who are engaging with the community. And they are very community engaged. This is a photograph from the Country Women's Association tea rooms in Lismore, where I did some community feedback, which shows you that you can make connections in all kinds of curious and interesting and unexpected places. So 50% say that they feel very or mostly community connected to LGBT communities. 50% say most or all of their friends are LGBTQ. But and that hasn't really changed over time, but what has changed is the way that people engage with community. So this is a demonstration of that. So the proportion who say that they attended an LGBTQ event recently has dropped over the last, this is about 10, 12 years. Where we see a dramatic drop is the proportion who say that they've been to a lesbian or queer women's night, and that reflects a real change in commercial possibilities. So it's actually, there are very few places that you could go and do that kind of thing now, so that's almost half. A similar drop in the proportion who are saying they're going to a gay night, and I think again this also demonstrates a kind of shift in the social organisation of people's lives, which is much more mixed venues and much more mixed events. Not much change in terms of LGBTQ meetings. It looks like there's no change in community event engagement, but actually there was. So there was quite a considerable drop. There was about 14% that it dropped by. And then marriage equality debate happened, and people went back to community events. So I think it's interesting to kind of look at the way those kinds of trends can happen. SWASH has always been branded as the women's survey, so people go looking for it at Fair Day, and they go up to the GCPS men's survey stall and say, where's the women's survey? So it's really clearly been seen as a women's survey. So we've never actually asked people about their gender, which was an interesting oversight that demonstrates the ways in which things have changed quite dramatically. We asked a trans status question, and we got quite a lot of community feedback, and by feedback, for anyone who works with community, they know what I mean. They were very unhappy and said, you need to make this better. And ACON has some standard questions that they recommend people use, so we added those to the 2018 survey. So that's the two-step gender question, which of the following best describes your gender identity, and what gender or sex actually I think is correct, where you assigned at birth. So this is what we found. So 13% of our sample identified as trans or gender diverse, which was much more than we were expecting, mostly because it's so clearly branded as a women's survey. So it's interesting to see people deciding to do it anyway. The other thing that surprised us was how many of the people responding were non-binary identifying, that would often get lost, I think, in a lot of the ways that we ask these questions usually. So I think this is really important, and it really caused us a lot of thought about the way that we then talked about what SWASH was about. And so the way we talk about SWASH now and the way it's reflected in the survey report is it's about LBQ women and non-binary people. That may change. I think that will probably sustain for the next iteration, but that this is a very live, dynamic issue in terms of how the community feels about where different parts of the community feel they belong. Another area where we've seen some really interesting changes is around sexuality indicators. And this is the proportion of lesbian versus bisexual versus other in the first iteration of the survey. This is what I like to think of as the lesbian heyday. That's in 2018. So something really dramatic happened between 2000 and 2018, which was a massive drop in the proportion of respondents who identified as lesbian. Almost no change really in terms of bisexually identifying people. So in several iterations ago, we noticed that the category other was becoming increasingly big. And when we looked at that, it was mostly people writing queer. So we added queer as an option. And you can see we've now got 20% of the respondents are identifying as queer, but still 8% identifying as other. And I think that's probably some of that other is pansexual is probably the thing that comes up most in that. I want to show you a breakdown by age. I always have to apologize for this slide, but you're numbers people, so I won't. So each of the big blocks is our age categories, and so the first thing you notice is that orange, which is lesbian or gay, much more likely to identify as lesbian or gay if you're in older category than you are in the younger category. Second thing I want you to notice is when we look inside those age categories, there's kind of been a reduction in the proportion identifying as lesbian for all of those ages, but it is most dramatic for the younger people. So the 16 to 24-year-olds here, you can see actually less than 40% of the younger women and non-binary people are identifying as lesbian. Lots of things to think about here. Language matters, really matters in terms of the way we do our research and in the way we provide services. So about how we call people into our research or our services, we need to pay attention to this. we need to pay attention to how age might affect that. So using queer might actually be a very excluding term for older women, but it might be a really important term for younger women. So really needing to be aware of that and tailoring appropriately. Okay, let's talk about alcohol use. So I'm more or less going to give you one slide for each of these big issues. So the information from these two tables, so these are two questions we ask about alcohol use. Actually, we asked 3 questions about alcohol use. The majority of respondents, so 88%, reported drinking alcohol, which is higher than we find around New South Wales for women. 32% reported that they drank alcohol weekly or more often. Younger drinkers were more likely to drink fewer days per week. Older drinkers were more likely to drink more days, which is what you'd expect. We used 2 guidelines, the 2 NHMRC guidelines, as our kind of indicator data. So the first one, drinking no more than 2 standard drinks on any day for a lifetime risk. So 48.7% of respondents were exceeding that. That was much higher among the younger respondents than the older respondents. And the second one, NHMRC, drinking no more than 4 standard drinks, so 16.9% reported alcohol use that exceeded that. We also asked people, how often would you drink 5 or more drinks on a single occasion? And 38.8% said that they did. Now, I think that's quite high. We don't ask a question about problematic alcohol use, and we don't ask about alcohol dependence. So it's very difficult to say much more than alcohol use is high. I can't tell you if it's problematic use. I think that's really important to keep in mind. But one of the things I wanted to kind of pause at this point and say is what I would hope you get from that is that alcohol use among LGBTQ women and non-binary people looks quite different to heterosexual women. And we've got good international data to show that. But I don't know that there's much visibility around that in the alcohol field, particularly here. We don't see the same disparity for gay men versus heterosexual men. So gay, bisexual men's drinking looks very similar to heterosexual men. Lesbian, bisexual, queer women look very different to heterosexual women. The speculations around the why of that is gender norms, so possibly that LGBTQ women aren't subject to gender norms in the same way that heterosexual women are. Commercial spaces are much more important, so alcohol licensed venues are a really important part of the way that LGBTQ communities organise themselves and socialise. Maybe less responsibility in terms of caring means that people are freer to drink, although there's not great evidence for that one. And of course, minority stress, so that actually the way in which people are dealing with their experiences of discrimination and stigma. Karen, I hope you don't mind me saying, we both shared with some of the people here this morning about the various ways in which we've experienced this just today. Whether that's trying to go into women's toilet without being bothered or being called sir on the airplane. So I think that that's, those very real kinds of things. But what I wanted to, I guess, draw attention to was the idea that actually we might really need to think about alcohol in relation to screening and research for LGBTQ women in different ways to how we think about it for heterosexual women. When it comes to illicit drug use, I'm going to give you the same message, actually. So 47% had used any drug in the last 6 months. That's really quite high, much higher than NDSHS, which looks at the last 12 months, and it's 13% of women had used any illicit drug use, reported any illicit drug use. So there's a whole range of questions here, drugs that I've listed here. I'm not giving you frequency at all. So this is just about any use in the last 6 months. We're obviously asking this in the middle of Mardi Gras season, so it's possible that if we asked it in the other 6 months, we'd get different kinds of answers, but I don't think that matters. We've not seen any change in this. Different drugs come up or down, but generally we have not seen any change in the proportion reporting any drug. 7% said that they had ever injected. Again, there's not been much change around that. Maybe 10 years ago it was a little bit higher, more like 10%. If we look at Jenny Iverson's work on the NSP survey, at 25% of the women who completed that survey over the 10 years they analysed were lesbian or bisexual. So there's nothing surprising here, and yet there's almost no visibility of illicit drug use for LGBTQ women. This is one of the most dissatisfying questions for me that we ask, which is, have you sought any AOD support? Because it tells us very little about what particular thing they sought support for, when did that happen. But it does kind of show some surprise, I think, in terms of it's only 11%, given what I've just told you about how much alcohol and illicit drug use that there is. I don't think there's much more to say about that, except the potential for treatment underutilization. And we actually know very little about effective treatment for LBQ women. I've just been reviewing the literature on alcohol treatment internationally, and there are no RCTs with LBQ women. There's several with gay men, yet we know that the alcohol problem's probably with lesbians and bisexual queer women. So some work that this has led to, and a shout out to my colleagues, Sonia Memdovic and Nicola Black, and also Louisa Degenhardt. So we're doing some research looking at clinical staff and LGBTI service users' experiences of substance use and mental health treatment. So we're in the middle of doing that work at the moment, and we're just starting to develop a cohort study on LBQ women and non-binary people and substance use, which is very exciting. Also some ACON-led work, so this is looking at local drug action teams to develop alcohol messaging for LBQ women and non-binary people. There's some work going on in Melbourne as well around alcohol use. All of that work is being, intervention work is being led by LGBTQI community organisations. Smoking. So a few years ago, Rachel and I did an analysis of 10 years of SWASH data to look at trends in smoking. So here's a figure from that. So that was current smoking across 10 years. So we started at about 35% and dropped down to about 30% at the end of those 10 years. That is a statistically significant but incredibly slow decrease. And for anyone who knows the smoking data, it's twice the rate of the general population, women in the general population. That's young women in SWASH, and they were women at that time. So that's kind of just above 50 to just below 50. There was no statistically significant drop in smoking across the 10 years that we had data for. That's pretty shocking stuff, and I had the pleasure of reporting that to the ACON board at a strategic planning, the 2 strategic plannings ago, and was really pleased that the board was similarly shocked, and ACON did quite a lot of work around that, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. Here's the age breakdown for that. So for the moment, ignore 2018, and what you basically see is what I've just described. No change really for the youngest cohort or the youngest group. Smoking decreasing a bit over time, but not much else going on. The thing I want you to notice in 2018 is a public health miracle that happened between 2016 and 2018, when smoking among the younger people dropped from something quite shocking, so up from just over 40% to drop to 23% in 2018. That's hard to interpret, really. It seems really unlikely to me. Maybe this is ACON's incredible intervention work, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, and you should probably crow from the tops of all the buildings. As an academic, I'm a bit concerned about what it might mean. And so we haven't crowed from any buildings, because I think we're going to wait to see what 2020 says. The important thing to know is, even though there's this dramatic drop, it is still twice the rate of the same age group of the general population of women. So even if something miraculous has happened, it's still very, very concerning, but it may mean that there's some change happening. 2018 was the first time that we had more women who had never smoked than we had women who had smoked or given up. That's pretty shocking. So that data led to various bits of work. So the paper Rachel and I wrote that I mentioned, ACON took this terrible news and went running with it and got some funding from Cancer Institute of New South Wales to do a bunch of work. So we did a systematic review of LGBTQ treatment interventions for smoking. We did a survey, and we have a paper published around the changes in social networks of smokers versus recent quitters that shows that LBQ women who recently quit had far fewer people in their social network who smoked, and were also much less likely to have a partner who smoked. Now, we don't know if they changed their social networks in order to facilitate smoking, but we certainly hear from women talking about how they feel like their world is saturated by smoking. Incredible campaign, Smoke Free, Still Fierce, which I'm sorry I don't have time to show you, but you should Google it. It's the best smoking intervention campaign you've ever seen. And some other work that happened. Really pleased to say Quit Victoria have recently come on board to be doing some great work with LGBT smoking also. I'm going to really quickly mention mental health because I think it's hard not to in this context. So what I want you to notice here is this is the K6, which is obviously not the best indicator that we have. We've been using it for a long time. So this is acute psychological distress in the last 4 weeks. So what I want you to notice is just how high it is. So this is the green and the blue together. So a quite significant proportion, the majority of respondents are experiencing high and very high acute distress. Something terrible happened here. So we had this big jump in the proportion reporting of young women reporting psychological distress. Does anybody know what was happening in late 2015, early 2016? Same-sex marriage equality debate suddenly caught up in the Liberal Party leadership. Safe schools was banned, and Gayby film was banned from New South Wales schools. There was also a lot of concern in the community around the impact of lockout laws, particularly in the inner west, and an increase in violence, same-sex related violence. So there was lots of stuff happening in the environment that I think may account for some of this. We don't have that data in SWASH, so I think that's interpretation. Last thing I want to leave you with. ACON put us under a lot of very reasonable pressure to ask questions about suicide and self-harm. Rachel and I were very nervous about asking people these questions in a context where they may be drinking or taking drugs or with the family at Mardi Gras Fair Day. But we've asked them, and we're very glad we have. So what I want you to pay attention to is just in the last 12 months. So 30% said that they had felt that life was not worth living in the last 12 months. 44.5% of the youngest and most vulnerable in the sample said that. Had you ever deliberately self-harmed yourself? So that was 14% overall, and 25% of those 16 to 24-year-olds. So there's something really worrying happening here that we really need to pay attention to and think about how that might relate to the alcohol and the drug use that I've mentioned. So where does this leave us? Alcohol use is high and it remains high. Illicit drug use is high and it remains high. Tobacco use is high but maybe reducing. LBQ women's alcohol and other drug use looks very different to heterosexual women, and we need to pay attention to this. So my challenge for you is, are you including sexuality and gender questions in all of your research projects? And if you aren't, why? So I would really encourage you to think very carefully about whether your disinclination to do that is because you didn't know, in which case now you know. No excuses. If your disinclination is because you think people will be uncomfortable about answering them, then I would suggest you have a think about whether that's your discomfort at asking them. I think that it's really important that we have this data. We have a massive data gap. So SWASH is still mostly where we have this information from. We have very few national data sets that are including sexuality and gender. I think we've probably lost the fight for the census, the next census, maybe the one after that. We really need this data. I hope I've convinced you of that. You are surrounded by people who have expertise on how to ask, how to consult, how to interpret, and how to disseminate. We will all help you do it because we're desperate for the data too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie, and just echo the importance. And I just want to let you know that that survey has been running for 23 years, and last year I think our massive ACON contribution to that was $20,000. It's not government funded. It's never been government funded. It's never received any research funding. So it's the, I guess, proof of what can be done through partnership and goodwill, and I commend it to you. Thank you very much. We're going to move into an important other family, community and vulnerable population presentation from Dr. Sara Farnbach. back. It's hard for me to tell my story. A qualitative study on male Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander drug and alcohol rehabilitation clients' experience with attending primary health care. And don't we all have a good doctor story? So I look forward to hearing you. Thanks.
All right, thanks Karen and thanks Julie. That's quite the presentation to follow, so I'll do my best to entertain you as thoroughly. So a little while ago, I was working with a GP who works at a residential drug and alcohol service, which is an Aboriginal specific service. And he said to me, he was reflecting on the clients that he sees there, and he said to me, why don't I see the men who come to the treatment service in my general practice? I don't see them in Aboriginal medical services or in general mainstream primary healthcare services. And so that's what kicked off this research project. But before I begin, I just want to take a moment to join others before me in acknowledging traditional custodians of the land, the Bedigal people, as well as of all the nations where participants come from who participated in this research, as well as where we conducted this research. Okay, so to answer this question, we set out to explore the perceptions of Aboriginal men who were in treatment for substance use, about their experiences seeking help in primary healthcare, about their substance use, as well as their preferences for accessing primary healthcare around substance use. So to do this, it was a qualitative grounded theory study where we had Aboriginal researchers who conducted semi-structured interviews with clients who were residential clients at the treatment service at the time. And we analysed the data by both inductive and deductive themes. So who did we talk to? In total, we spoke to 20 men, all of whom identified as Aboriginal, most of whom were from rural, remote or regional New South Wales. All of them, men were either on their first or second treatment stay as a majority, but some had previous stays. The average age was about 27, and most, about 60%, had been in either part-time or full-time employment in the previous 12 months before their treatment. Finally, ice was the most common drug of choice, but cannabis and alcohol was also reported. So what did we find? Okay, so two major themes arose from the analyses. The first was around asking for help for substance use, and this was for substance use, but also what was reported was substance use which caused some mental health conditions, but the men associated has been linked to the substance use. And the second was around developing an environment that was supportive and enabling for them within the primary healthcare service. So I'll talk you through these themes quickly now. Okay, so half the men, exactly 10, had spoken to somebody at the primary healthcare service about their substance use at some point. So this could be the GP, it was sometimes the nurse, it could be an Aboriginal health worker, but a few of the men actually reported speaking to reception staff when they were trying to book an appointment or when they were arriving for appointments as well. And they did this when it caused a problem, so when they thought that their substance use was really impacting on their life. So in these kind of yellowy box things, quotes that we've collected from the men. So I won't read them out because you can read quicker than I can, but as you can see here, this fellow's describing the impact that ice was having on him and how that caused him to seek out help from primary healthcare. So half of the men who had talked to somebody at the primary healthcare service talked to a GP who they already knew. So this was quite often someone who they referred to as a family doctor or a regular doctor who they saw on an ongoing basis. And as a result of these conversations, some were not offered any treatment. So you can see this quote here. This fellow talked to the GP who said, "I don't think you need rehab, you're right, just tough it out." However, on the other side, some were referred to substance use treatment, and some of them saw this as a negative outcome, and some of them saw this as a positive outcome. So I just want to stop here and just mark the fact that for some men, they did get what they wanted, and they received treatment that they felt fitted their needs. But for others, they felt as though once they received that referral to a treatment service, it actually wasn't what they wanted. What they wanted was to receive support from the GP there and then, and they felt passed on by getting referred externally. Okay, there were two sub-themes that fell under this theme. The first was about being unable to tell the full story. And this mostly related to fear. And this fear was usually because they were fearful of receiving bad news about their health if they disclosed the full information and went through a full health check. Some of the men also were fearful of stigma or judgment, being judged by the GP. And this man talked about fear that if he was really open and he described the extent of his substance use, that docs might find out and that he might lose his children. So he wasn't prepared to share the full story. Many of the men spoke about a time in their life when they were unable to access health or they weren't able to prioritise their health because of their substance use. So you can see from this quote here, this man was talking about being in the drug world and how chaotic and complex his life was, and that was a real barrier for him. And one client described the fact that he had that ongoing relationship with a GP who he knew as being a barrier for him because he didn't want information about his substance use to get back to his community, so he wasn't prepared to really tell the full story to the GP. Okay, our second theme, so this is about the supportive primary healthcare environment. We had 4 sub-themes that developed under this. And the first one, which came through really strongly, was around accessing the same GP on a regular basis. As you can see for this quote, a lot of the men talked about having to repeat their same stories again and again at every appointment and how they found this really challenging. A lot of these men had really difficult past, really difficult stories. Many were struggling with trauma, and having to sit down and start every consultation with those stories again was something that they really struggled with. Many of the men reported that they would prefer to have access to, which they might not always use, but they would like to have access to an Aboriginal health worker at some stage, and that this could help them because they felt that Aboriginal staff really got their situations. They understood their circumstances and the causes for some of their decisions, whereas they felt that sometimes the non-Aboriginal staff didn't have that same perspective. Similarly, having a support person was really important. So having either a family member or a friend who could come along to appointments, help them to book appointments, help them to get to appointments, as well as to write things down while they were in with the consultation to help them to remember and to hold them to account and follow up after they'd finished the discussion. Most of the men did have at least one person who they could report as being a support person for them. So finally, part of the treatment in the residential treatment facility where these men were interviewed was a really strong focus on culture. And for many of the men, this was something that they valued strongly and they thought was a really important part of their treatment because they felt that their culture had been lost or stolen from them. And they really valued that opportunity that they had to develop those connections while they were in treatment. It was just something that they wanted to continue once they left and that they saw as being an important part of their ongoing recovery. A lot of the men reported their awareness of men's groups, cultural groups, or traditional groups such as dancing groups, and they thought that a lot of these groups were connected with particularly Aboriginal medical services, but with primary healthcare. And so they saw that as an opportunity for them to stay linked with healthcare services once they left treatment. Okay, so what does all this mean? So obviously we were kind of wrong when we started out. There are opportunities in primary healthcare to engage with Aboriginal men who use substances. I think that the difficulties that these men discussed are completely understandable, especially about repeating the stories again and again. I think that's a really difficult thing to expect from people at a really difficult time. And so what can we do about it? I think we really need to have a focus on developing those relationships and on being able to access the same healthcare team on an ongoing basis so you're not constantly having to go over stories again and again. I think that's quite a realistic and reasonable request. The diversity in what the men perceived as being useful for them, so some men wanted treatment there while others wanted to be referred externally, I think shows that we need to have a flexible system that has a range of services and that can be tailored to each individual's need. One of the real strengths that came through was about this cultural strength that the men felt that they developed whilst they were in treatment. And so I think that's something that we can really use to build on and to support these men going forward and really develop, it's quite a low cost a lot of these systems are already set up, and something that we can really use to build on to support these men going forward, whether it's men's groups or cultural groups, but also the Aboriginal workforce within the health system. Now, obviously, we've only spoken to a small group of men at one service, so this might not be a completely representative sample. And we've asked men to talk about what was quite difficult events often at a difficult time, so there might be some recall bias as well. But on the flip side, the men who we spoke to, a lot of these conversations were quite lengthy, and they spoke very openly and honestly, we felt, during the discussions, and that was because of the relationship that they had with the interviewers. And everybody who we asked who was eligible agreed to take part. So finally, I just want to thank the research team who worked on this with me, in particular Jamie and Maddie, who both tried to come today and present this research, but life got in the way, and who conducted the interviews for the research. And I thought I'd just finish with a story about how well it can go. You can see from this quote, this man is describing a time when he received really good support from his GP, which really helped him during his treatment, because it was good for him to know that somebody really cared. So thank you.
Thank you. And I realised I didn't address the issue of questions, and we kicked off this session 3 minutes late. So if you have a question, please write it down, and hopefully we can make up some time. Thank you for that. Just want to move us quickly on to our next presenter, Dr. Julia Lappin. The transition of substance-induced psychosis in schizophrenia, a systematic review and meta-analysis. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks a lot. I'm actually going to present today together with Ben. We've worked together on this systematic review in conjunction with colleagues Grant Sara and Matthew Large, and we thought that we would do a bit of a double act today. I'll start off giving some background, and I'll finish up as well giving some context to the discussion, and Ben will talk you through our methods and results. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, and just to frame for you why we're in the community session, we are looking here at a serious problem where people who have comorbid substance use and severe mental illness often aren't recognised to be in need of medical help, which might be extended to people presenting with similar symptoms in the absence of substance use. So specifically what we're looking at is the idea that for some people a psychotic illness is a substance-related psychotic illness rather than just a psychotic illness which has been triggered or precipitated in the context of substance use, which is a very common comorbidity. And this is the outline of what we're going to do today. So we'll start with the overview. So substance or drug-induced psychosis are brief psychotic syndromes triggered by substance use. These can persist for days or weeks after intoxication, and the estimated incidence is between 1.5 and 6.5 per 100,000 person years. It's actually a reasonably common diagnosis. In fact, up to 25% of hospital admissions may have this diagnosis, and we particularly see it among younger people, and that's because younger people, particularly in their 20s and 30s, are that component of the population who are more likely to be substance using. It's also the case that for young men, there is a peak in psychosis incidence in the 20s, although it's slightly later for women. That would be more like in the early to mid-30s. So there is substance use for men in particular, at a time when you're already at your highest likelihood of exhibiting your first psychotic symptoms. But the issue, as I've outlined in the early part of the talk, is that often substance-related psychotic symptoms are regarded as benign and self-limiting. And for that reason, people with substance-related psychoses are often excluded from more general psychosis studies, and that's important because they're then not included in follow-up studies, and we don't know what really happens to them, and that's what we tried to address in this study. Because we know that for many people who develop a first psychotic episode, whatever the theme of that psychosis, be it a manic psychosis, substance-related, a brief, transient psychosis, many of those people will make a transition to the much more severe and enduring psychotic illness known as schizophrenia, and that's one which is associated with very poor clinical and functional outcomes and, unfortunately, lifelong disability for about 3/4 of the people who suffer it. And the transition rate is highly dependent in substance-related psychoses on the substance used. And we knew before we conducted the study that cannabis has a particularly high rate of transition. But if you do a review of the literature, you find that, in fact, there isn't agreement on how many people go on to develop schizophrenic illness following a substance-induced psychosis. And that's because of the things I've highlighted, that often some people are excluded. There's different types of substances. There may be different follow-up rates. And that explains the range of percentage transitions to later schizophrenia that we see here. So these are 3 studies all conducted with good methodology, but which range in their results from 17 to 66%. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand over to Ben, and then I'll be back.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, so the aim of our meta-analysis was to synthesize all the data from longitudinal observational studies of transition from substance-induced psychosis to schizophrenia. So in addition to that, we also wanted to look at the various moderators of this transition. So things such as, the type of substance used, sex, rural or urban location, and then certain methodological issues regarding the papers themselves, such as follow-up and quality. So like any good systematic review, we created a broad search strategy, and this was aimed at collecting as many potentially relevant abstracts as we could before narrowing that down to the final included studies. And so the studies we did want to include firstly needed a baseline diagnosis of substance-induced psychosis, or brief, atypical, not otherwise specified, or schizophreniform, and we used those as a comparator. So they first needed the baseline diagnosis, then a follow-up diagnosis in the same population, and detailing how many of those transitioned to schizophrenia. So we only included case series, case controls, RCTs, and cohort studies. So we found over 6,000 abstracts, and slowly but surely got through them and identified 191 studies that we read in full text. And then from there found 50 studies which gave us the data that we were looking for. So 25 of those studies showed us substance-induced psychosis, and the other 25 showed us the brief and atypical side of things. So as you can see, substance-induced psychosis transitioned to schizophrenia 25% of the time. Now this is, as you can see, the brief and atypical was 30% transition rate, and slightly higher, but very similar. And as expected, not otherwise specified, and schizophreniform had much higher transition rates. So when looking at the particular substances, cannabis had the highest rate of transition to schizophrenia from cannabis-induced psychosis at 34%, hallucinogens at 26%, amphetamines and mixed was 22%, and then 12% and under were your alcohol, sedatives, and opioids. Interestingly, what we found in the study was that alcohol was much more represented. There were many more people presenting with alcohol-induced psychosis. However, they did have the lowest rate of transition to schizophrenia. So in terms of looking at the other moderators, so we found that studies of older people reported a lower rate of transition, and there was no association between sex, duration of follow-up, proportion followed up, year of publication, or the location, rural or urban. And now I'll hand back over to Julia for the implications.
Okay, thanks very much, Ben. So clearly we have a problem. Substance-related psychoses are as likely to transition essentially as brief and limited psychotic illnesses. And we therefore, I think, need to try and get the message across that where there are psychotic symptoms in the context of substance use, where those symptoms are enduring and last beyond intoxication, that we need to take psychotic symptoms seriously. And I think that we need to do that in the emergency department and in the drug and alcohol setting, but also in the mental health setting. We need to take very seriously comorbid substance use. And then to touch on the key findings. So more than 1/3 were with cannabis-induced psychosis. So what we know is that cannabis use is common, and also that transition to schizophrenia in young people with psychosis in the context of cannabis is common. It's consistent with a lot of literature that's come out in the last 1 or 2 decades, showing that cannabis use doubles the risk of developing schizophrenia in people who are vulnerable. And what do we mean by vulnerable? Well, we mean people. It's evident that if you have psychotic symptoms when you're using substances, in a way you're already vulnerable to the experience of psychotic symptoms, and that you may be more likely to develop a chronic and enduring psychotic illness. It's particularly true where we see young people who have a family history or genetic predisposition to the development of psychosis, as evidenced by psychotic illness or indeed other severe mental illness in first or second degree relatives. And we also know that risk factors that increase risk for psychosis in the general population will also play here, and that includes things like minority status, childhood experience of adversity and trauma. And so what we really want you to take, if you just take home one key message today, is that substance-induced psychosis is not a benign or self-limiting condition, and it should be treated assertively, and we should try and work together as mental health and alcohol and drug services to ensure that people aren't falling through the gaps, and not only that, but they're getting as best as possible integrated care that targets both their problems. It's a serious problem internationally, and particularly here in Australia, where we have over 1 in 5 first hospital admissions for psychosis being substance-related. It's not a problem we should ignore. One final point that I wanted to make is that the length of follow-up was not associated with the transition rate. And what that means is that it doesn't appear particularly to be the case that the longer you go on using, the odds are that you'll increase your risk. It seems to be that if the individual has factors that make him or her vulnerable to transition, that transition will occur. And this is a piece that I just wanted to share where we made the case that in fact, we need to be assertively outreaching to people who are experiencing psychotic symptoms in the context of substance use, just as we make attempts to assertively outreach to young people who are having a first episode psychosis, to intervene early, to try and minimise the clinical and functional impairments that are associated with any type of psychotic illness. Okay, and the final thoughts for our talk are that we do need to monitor and provide ongoing support, and decisions regarding care should consider the different risks involved with each substance. So alcohol, many people use it, while Ben made the point that alcohol-related psychoses are reasonably common, but the transition rate is a bit smaller because there's just so many more people using alcohol, just to explain that point. Cannabis is the drug where we see the highest proportion of people making a transition, but the psychostimulants and hallucinogens are also very problematic. And we need to ask about substance use, and we need to ask also about comorbid substance use and polysubstance use, and ask about individual risk factors for psychosis. And that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, and apologies to Ben, I didn't introduce you properly. I'm failing as a chair all over the place. But just want to, on the subject of failure, I think it's interesting for people who've been in the sector for a while that we're still having conversations about mental health and drug and alcohol and the need to work better together, and all the, case management and other issues that arise from that. So thank you for your presentation. It's my absolute pleasure to invite now to the podium Associate Professor Lucy Burns with the very inviting, title of Sex, Drugs and Violence. Lucy is at NDARC. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sorry, there's no sex in this. It was just to get you here. And it worked, yay! So, okay, so I use this thing? Yep. Okay. I can see Don Weatherburn over there in the audience, so if I say anything wrong, don't say anything else. Okay. Okay. So, look, the major thing I'm going to be really talking about today is essentially violence against women, and mainly domestic violence, and how the patterns and types of violence do differ by sex, gender. And we look a little bit at what lies behind that particular pattern, but also how we can perhaps go moving ahead to actually start to incorporate some of the things we know from drug and alcohol to the domestic violence arena, because there is it's still very, very siloed. This is something that is recently undertaken, personal safety survey in 2016, and it's shown here how common violence itself is. So it shows here that about 42% of men and 37% of women have experienced some form of violence since the age of 15. So that's equals about 3.7 million men and 2.9 million women experiencing physical violence, with a reverse trend in terms of sexual violence, as you'd expect. So far more women, 1 in 5, and 1 in 20 men experience some form of sexual violence. And as Don would say, I know, that a lot of incidents of assault and domestic violence don't get into the numbers that we look at, so it's probably much higher. I didn't actually tell you that, I don't need to define what violence is, but this is, well, I suppose I do, but you can read it yourself. You probably know it. But anyway, that's what it is. That's the World Health Organization definition anyway. Back I go. Okay. And with respect to partner violence, I mean, I think it's just become so much more salient over the past, 10 or so years, particularly since we had that horrific incident with Roseanne Batty and her son. We've become more aware of the nature or the extent of domestic violence in Australia and how common it is. And the fact is that whilst we might be seeing the nature of violence decreasing over time, with partner violence we're not seeing any changes really. So what we found here from the survey is that 17% of women and 6% of men had experienced some sort of violence by a partner since the age of 15. And if you just think a little bit about the number of people who are in this room and think about those numbers, I mean, there's probably quite a few of us that have been through some element of something like this ourselves. God, arrows go the wrong way. Of course, the most severe outcome of any sort of violence and domestic violence is homicide, and this is taken by the homicide monitoring system, and it looks at, I've just really looked at data in 2010 and to 2012 and looked at the nature of the incidents by classification and also by sub-classification in terms of the nature of the relationship between the person and the perpetrator. So you can see here that domestic violence is, responsible for well over a third of those. The classification is well over a third of incidents. And when we look at domestic violence here, domestic homicide, you can see that intimate partner violence is the one that is most common and problematic. Or they're all problematic, but it's most common, and I think that's why we're really starting to keep on looking at this. When we look at the nature of the homicide by the actual sex of the victims, we again see this differential pattern. I think that's what we're saying, is we are seeing different patterns. So that when we're looking, for example, in red here, we've got, if we look at intimate partner violence, if you look at the subtotal here, you can see that once we put it all together, when the males are a victim, it's about 38% of cases of domestic violence, but it's almost double, 62% of cases when incidents when the female is a victim, so they're twice as likely. Whereas it's a bit reversed when we're looking at acquaintance homicide and stranger homicides. And because we're looking at substance use here, and again, it's problematic in terms of actually really getting a feel for whether drugs and alcohol are involved in these incidents, particularly in terms of the perpetrator, because they won't be subject to all the toxicological tests and confirmations that the victims are. But I think what we found here, or what was found here in these two sets of years of homicide data, was that any alcohol use was involved in more than a third of cases, and any drug use in approximately a fifth. So that really is very high, and it's very high considering the fact that we haven't really paid attention to this. And I think particularly with amphetamines, methamphetamine, which is, is so commonly talked about now, and ice, and I know Rebecca Wood down the back there, our meth expert, will be maybe touching on this afternoon, I'm not sure. But there is a real call to start looking at the nature of the substances that are on board in these particular situations. I think when we move from Australia to violence against women generally, I mean, it's really common worldwide. You know, about 1 in 3 women over the world will have experienced some sort of violence, and this is violence now. Obviously, some countries are much more high-level prevalence than others. But internationally, violence against women and girls is classified as one of the most prevalent human rights violations in the world, and doesn't seem to know any boundaries in terms of economic or national boundaries. Having said that, whilst it knows no boundaries, there are some subgroups are actually far more likely to have some element of domestic violence than others. But the central element that we're looking in terms of domestic violence is that it's an ongoing behavioural pattern that aims at controlling a partner through a number of means, such as, you know, fear, for example, using violent behaviour which is violent and threatening, such as also financial, emotional, and various other forms. In most cases, it's aimed at exerting power and control, and it includes a range of physical, sexual and psychological abuse. And can leave women extremely powerless, vulnerable, and really unable to do or really feel much at that point. In contemporary Australia, and I know we've seen this around, and I think this is when we start, you know, talking about, you know, I guess over the past 5 years, really, we know now, or we're told that, you know, 1 woman is killed, you know, on a weekly basis by their partner, and 2 in 5 assaults reported to the police, and these are just those reported to police, are family, domestic related, and women are 3 times more likely to experience violence from an intimate partner, and 5 times more likely to actually require medical attention or hospitalisation for that. Domestic violence here also remains one of the leading causes of homelessness. And we know that now that about 1/3 of all clients receiving assistance for specialist homelessness services are recipients or are victims. That's recipients, you ask for it, I don't know, I see it, victims of domestic violence. And once you're in the homelessness arena, you're cycling in and out, and it becomes problematic in itself. Oh, 5 minutes, okay. I'm just going to touch briefly on the drug use, okay? So, look, we know Australians drink a lot, let's face it, you know, 80% of us drink something a year, and drinking frequency, you know, it occurs frequently on a regular basis, either weekly or daily. And when we look at drugs, most commonly it's cannabis, cocaine and ecstasy, followed by methamphetamine, but when you look at frequency, ecstasy and cocaine are used less frequently than methamphetamine, and methamphetamine, the purity or the type of methamphetamine is becoming more potent now. So again, I gave a talk not so long ago and on this topic and the domestic violence, where it said, look, they're just seeing all these women there, all being there because their injuries are sustained by their partner on methamphetamine, or they're both on methamphetamine. But we know that, you know, it's like we know much more about alcohol than other drugs, and we know that not all people who drink become aggressive. So it's not that alcohol itself initiates the aggressive situation, but it is actually associated with much more severe and more chronic cases of violence and injury. So males with drug and alcohol problems inflict more violence, and they're more apt to inflict more serious violence and sexual assaults. How does it work? Well, that gentleman earlier who gave us a very quick talk on AIDS, was it? Sorry, you know, guy from Yale. Yeah, well, he gave you all the biology of what goes on in the brain, so I'm not going to do that. But initially, alcohol causes direct impairment in cognition, reduction in impulse control, and what that means is most commonly a person doesn't have the skills. If they don't have great communication skills, they're more likely to resort to violent approaches, and then as drinking becomes more chronic, this propensity to violence increases. Other situational things, financial hardships, exacerbate the tension, and all those things go together, become more chronic and cyclical. This is some work I'm actually doing. And it's actually quite interesting. It's a big linked data set, and I won't go into the details at all, but what we have found there is that when you looked at, people are admitted for assaults as their primary thing, what other sort of drugs would they have on board? And we found that whilst males were highly more likely to have an alcohol diagnosis on board, women were actually far more likely to have sedatives occurring at the same time. And I don't know what that means yet. We've got to unpack that. It may be there's some, they may be, taking a lot of sedatives to deal with their situation, or it may be some sort of date rape type thing. I'm not sure yet. I'm just going to briefly touch on the issue with having two sectors involved here. So we've got a sector, the domestic violence sector and the drug and alcohol sector. The domestic violence sector really is zero tolerance of violence, and that's really what it should be. And there is some emphasis on prevention, but it's far more making women secure and safe. There is a tension, however, because once you, the criminal justice approach, which is to stop situations occurring and ensuring that people are properly sentenced, it seems it's a bit counter with an early intervention where we're actually looking at stopping people become perpetrators in the beginning, and we know that at this point we can reduce recidivism with appropriate programs, and we know that we have a whole range of substance use, not for amphetamines just yet, but we do have a whole host of substance use appropriate treatment programs that are appropriate and effective and available. So just for conclusion, we know that substance use is a strong risk factor both for violence and homicide. Where current policy approach to reduce substance use is limited actually in situations where the crimes are serious and involve arrest and incarceration, and often this is the situation for domestic violence where zero tolerance is the overriding principle. So we have a tension there happening there. Key public health approaches notes, however, there are a whole range of other things that should be taken into account. And at our level, at the drug and alcohol level, what we can do is look at combining and working with domestic violence sector across all approaches, in terms of the population prevention, working with high-risk communities and at the individual levels. And I'm sure that will provide us some good opportunity for effective intervention and prevention. Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Just want to wrap up by saying a couple of things. One is thank you to NDARC for putting on an important session, I think, as part of the symposium today, really underlining the impact of drug and alcohol use as it applies to subpopulations such as LGBTQ people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are trying to seek out and support through rehab and primary care. People with mental health problems coming in, particularly to EDs and others that really do need better joined-up solutions that are evidence-informed, and of course its role in the horrific, I think, stats around violence against women. So thank you very much. The burdens of disease, criminal safety, inclusion, discrimination, all these things sit underneath the surface, and I think when you add drugs and alcohol to the mix, they play out in all sorts of perverse ways, and they deserve more attention than they get often from governments and policymakers because they're hard and difficult. Anyway, now that I've ranted, I just want to say to you all, could you please put your hands together and thank all of our presenters for their preparation and work.